Special thank you to the Walt Disney Corporation for repeatedly blocking this upload. A franchise in decline. Despite having over a decade to crack the Star Wars code, Disney stumbles from project to project without a clear or unified vision. After exhausting a gallery of legacy characters through misguided deconstructions, unworthy rush spin-offs, and hollow cameos, Disney Star Wars is now a sea of plagiarized mediocrity, with each new endeavor rife with potential to further destroy the legacy of George Lucas. In the cold, hard light of hindsight, we now ask ourselves, is this what we wanted? Is this what we were searching for? Or were we fans perhaps too harsh on the vision of the original creator? Would you believe the same length of time has now passed between the release of Disney Star Wars The Force Awakens and Skeleton Crew as the time between the release of Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith and when Disney bought Star Wars?
No, that's not true! That's impossible!
Hard to fathom, I'm sure, but it is true that indeed 2 decades respectively have passed since George Lucas's last Star Wars film premiered in cinemas, with the latter decade under the rule of Disney. But where the former decade was relatively sparse in terms of new inclusions, less the Clone Wars, Disney's has been the creative equivalent of space monkeys flinging poop at the silver and small screen to see what sticks. They say that time heals all wounds, and there is an element of truth to the expression in Hollywood, in that some films that are not well received at the time of release go on to garner a greater appreciation as time goes on. While I would argue this is true of the Star Wars prequels, others would strongly disagree. Star Wars, it seems, exists in its own pop culture vacuum in that regard, often with initial opinions remaining fairly firm and consistent despite the ever-persistent imperial march of time. The divide remains strong even 20 years later. In my travels, I have spoken to people that to this day draw the line at The Empire Strikes Back, citing Return of the Jedi as childish when compared to its forebear. Others have drawn the line prior to the Star Wars special editions of 1997, saying George Lucas ruined his own work after the fact with the changes he made. But the clear divide for Lucas Star Wars still lies between Jedi and the Phantom Menace, with even fewer, albeit more over time with the additions of Clone Wars and retrospectives of the sequel era, wholly embracing a larger view of George's work, which includes the Star Wars prequels. Regardless of where you personally draw the line with Star Wars acceptance, enough time has now passed between the end of the Lucas era and the start of Disney's to have a frank chat about the Star Wars prequels, and more specifically, why some people still harbour dislike towards them.
What are you doing? You're not actually going into an asteroid field.
I'm limiting the scope of this video to that of George Lucas's Star Wars films, i.e. episodes 1 to 6, and will not be discussing the expanded universe, Clone Wars, or the sequels in any great detail. Yes, I know and accept all of them, in some shape or form, provide explanations, context, and retroactivisms that are appropriate to the appreciation of the prequels. They are not, however, the reason for the dislike of the films themselves. So, with that in mind, there are 3 primary categories that critics cite when discussing the quality of the prequels, those being the overuse of CGI, the dialogue and acting quality, as well as the story itself, and we'll dive deep and wide on all of them. We'll also, true to form, take a mini deep dive on George Lucas himself first to establish critical context. But as I'm a magnanimous jellyfish, the metric of measurement for this dive is intent versus implementation. What did Lucas want to achieve with the prequels, and how well did he execute on it in the eyes of the fandom? So you may skip to this timestamp if you're not a fan of long preamble.
You are not just a coward, you are a traitor!
But now that the problematic prawns have jumped ahead and you beautiful loyalists have loitered, the crew will now check our precious seals for what promises to be our deepest dive yet. While we wait, since I published Why Do People Hate Disney Star Wars and the Crimes of Dave Filoni, there have been many depth charges dropped into my sheltered harbour accusing I, the working jellyfish, of Lucas and prequel hate, to which I say, liar! Anecdotally, I grew up with the prequels and special editions. In a very real sense, they were often my babysitter, but that is a personal story for another time. The prequels, as well as the original trilogy, have their problems, but as I've always said, George Lucas's Star Wars are more than the sum of their parts. One that I appreciate in its entirety entirety regardless of its clunkiness, and yes, that is an admission of comparative quality between the OT and prequels. Pardon the segue, I just want the record to reflect that I love the prequels and harbour no ill will towards them personally. That said, my personal adoration of Lucas's films is not the purpose of this video. We're here to discuss why others don't share my sentiment. I just wanted to be clear about my personal stance, and by extension bias, on the matter before we begin, and that I'll do my best to limit my natural protective instincts. But what can I say? I get passionate about Star Wars, and particularly protective of Star Wars created by George Lucas, and sometimes my passion gets in the way of my ability to remain impartial. However, moving forward, please remember, this is a discussion of why people dislike the prequels, and not necessarily representative of how I feel about the films personally. Are those terms clear?
They are clear, my master.
Excellent. So with that said, lock S-foils in attack position, Skipper, and close up formation.
We're on your tail, General Kenobi.
Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
The question of prequel hate, much like the topic of Star Wars itself, is linked to its creator, George Lucas. And to understand the great mystery that is Star Wars, one must study all its aspects. So let's first talk about the man, the myth, the maker. George, and by extension his films, evolved over time. And while the values of the introspective young art students from Modesto, values like the importance of friendship and the clearly defined moralities of good and evil that grew to make Star Wars remain strong throughout his life, as did his editorial style, Lucas the filmmaker is not, creatively speaking, the same man who set to work making the Phantom Menace as the naive young filmmaker who made Star Wars A New Hope. Lucas's early career was plagued with technical limitations, financial restrictions, studio meddling, and perhaps worst of all in his eyes, judging by how often he brings it up in interviews, Hollywood politics. As a creative, Lucas was often stonewalled by studio executives who didn't quite get what he was trying to make. Even after projects were approved, he clashed with studio executives whom he described as more fiscal bean counters than actual filmmakers. As early as his first and second feature films, THX 1138 and American Graffiti respectively, he was at odds with studios over Final Cut privileges and soundtrack choices. In both instances, and after the success of Star Wars, he would demand the films be restored to their original lengths after being edited by the studio for their theatrical releases. From his first film, Lucas waged a battle of individual creativity against corporate studio meddling. The new kid on the block versus the establishment who weren't eager to pass the torch. His experience on Star Wars A New Hope was similar. Fox had little faith, refused to fund pre-production, and slashed marketing costs. Lucas struck back by securing merchandising rights, a move that, ironically, gave him the freedom to fund his future films. I personally find it oddly appropriate that George had to use all his spheres of influence to assure that Star Wars was put to screen the way he envisioned, including personal financial sacrifices like funding Industrial Light and Magic out of his own pocket. After the success of Star Wars, but frustrated by the financial frictions from the first film, Lucas funded The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi himself. With his newly established special effects company, ILM, the sequel rights inclusive of Final Cut, and with his own funds bearing the risk, his creative control of the films was assured, which had become his primary goal following his experience with Warner on American Graffiti, thus forming his filmmaking mantra, creative control greater than profit.
Hey, I knew that was more to you than money.
Despite the success of Star Wars, Lucas would continue to clash with the studio system on Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Empire Strikes Back, the further arbitrary creative coercion alienating him from the Hollywood community, cutting his ties to Hollywood to become a truly independent filmmaker, less his distribution deal with Fox. Despite his relatively rapid success as a filmmaker, it's not an understatement to say that Lucas fought Hollywood every step of the way, before, during, and after the success of the original Star Wars trilogy, going as far as to build Lucasfilm home base, Skywalker Ranch, an idyllic filmmaking haven away from Hollywood with state-of-the-art editing facilities that would reduce the amount of time his wife Marsha was required to be away editing on other films in the San Francisco Bay Area of his youth, just to get out of the Hollywood studio bubble. By the 20th anniversary of Star Wars in 1997, George had amassed an independent technological film empire with Lucasfilm, LucasArts, and Lucas Digital, encumbering THX, Skywalker Sound, and ILM. But the sum of George Lucas as a creator is more than just Lucasfilm and Star Wars, and the inverse of all the professional triumphs was a personal life that suffered tremendously following the success of Star Wars A New Hope. George likened his early career to a train climbing a mountain. Once A New Hope was successful, following the monumental climb, the train crested the summit and George had to lean on the brakes from that point forward. Star Wars consumed him from 1973 to 1983, with a decade of his life focused on nothing but completing his magnum opus, his side quest in Indiana Jones, and his pet project, building Skywalker Ranch. What started as a desire to simply tell his fairy tale in space rapidly became an international phenomenon, an empire unto itself, with expectations of the highest order. George is, by all reports, a perfectionist workaholic introvert. While he leveraged the financial success of American Graffiti to make Star Wars and then From A New Hope to complete his trilogy, he never fully embraced the associated limelight, fame, or riches. His passion was a solitary one in his work, and during the original trilogy, his work became his life. Directing, reading, writing, and editing, often at the expense of time with his then wife, Marcia, whom had been with George since before the climb started and was a regular soundboard for him, particularly during the drafting of A New Hope. Marcia is said to have been the yin to Lucas's yang, social, extroverted, and more keen than George to enjoy the trappings of their success, often cited as the heart to Lucas's head, and is rightly credited for influencing the more human elements of George's clinical writing. After American Graffiti made them both millionaires, a film for which Marcia was an editor, she would implore George to take more holidays, attend parties, and throttle back on work so they could start a family. While the couple wanted children, they had complications conceiving and would eventually adopt a daughter in 1981. This shared bond in parenthood, however, was not enough to keep them together. George became ever more consumed by his work, promising his wife that they would have time to enjoy themselves after he finished the trilogy and completed Skywalker Ranch. Despite his promises, George spent more and more time away from home, supervising both The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi overseas, even while stepping back from the role of director, leaving Marcia back in the US with an ever-growing sense that in their financial success, that she had lost her independence, her connection with her husband, and that things were never going to slow down enough for the two of them, despite their successful careers. Eventually, Marcia would find comfort in the arms of another man, although she is adamant that she was never physically unfaithful to George while they were still married.
Oh, great.
The couple agreed to divorce in 1983, announcing the news to Lucasfilm after the release of Return of the Jedi. Aside from the financial cost of losing his wife and partner in Lucasfilm, a monetary loss somewhere in the realm of $30 to $50 million, the divorce took an immense personal toll on George, whom was arguably at the height of his creative powers when Return of the Jedi released, literally one of, if not the, most sought-after writer-director in Hollywood. This event is the often cited reason as to why the Temple of Doom was so much darker in tone to Raiders of the Lost Ark, with Lucas, the writer, alongside Spielberg as the director, both going through relationship upheaval at the time and thus losing the feminine influences in their work. Tentacle tap, this will be important later. So, just when George was reaching the prime of his creative potential, with the age of digital filmmaking less than a decade away, his divorce blindsided him, forever changing his priorities and leaving him alone at the top of the filmmaking empire that he had built. After the divorce, Lucas's perspective on life shifted, realizing that he had lost his wife. He was determined not to do the same with his daughter, choosing family ahead of film for the next 15 years. In that time, he adopted 2 more children, a boy and a girl, and was seen in the eyes of the world as a reclusive Mr. Mum, focused on parenting ahead of his other pursuits. While George continued to spearhead Lucas Digital and produce, edit, and sound mix films at Lucasfilm, he would not direct another movie again until 1997, when he felt his children were old enough to understand his work and his absence, which, coincidentally, was when principal photography commenced on Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace. I wonder if that will become relevant to this discussion. Lucas's formative years in the film business, and more importantly, the creative frictions and coercion he experienced, would forever shape his future films, endowing him with an unmatched resolve to make his films the way he envisioned. George's vision for Star Wars was always much broader than what could be imagined by Hollywood executives, filmgoers, and what could be technically achieved with 1970s special effects, to the point where he had to fight on all fronts to achieve his vision, whether the film lived up to his expectations or not. Which, appropriately enough, brings us to our first crab off the bank, the CGI of the prequels.
Just like the simulation.
One of the key frictions and often cited reasons for many that dislike the prequels, and by extension the Star Wars special editions, lie between Lucas's vision and the means in which that vision was achieved, i.e. intent versus execution. In the case of Star Wars, that tension is first and foremost captured in terms of special effects, which increased in complexity with each subsequent film. Lucas's anthology are lauded for being at the cutting edge of special effects at their time of release. From the first full-motion starship dogfight in cinema to the first fully realised CGI character in a film, the opening picture in each trilogy set a technical benchmark for things to come, not just for Star Wars, but for upcoming films of the era as well. While the original trilogy effects were achieved with analogue high-speed, stop-motion puppets as well as blue-screen matting and models on wires for the most part, which was revolutionary at the time, the prequel trilogy saw a reliance on the newly developed digital technology of computer-generated images, or CGI. While it is true that a large number of miniatures, models, and blue screens were used during production on the prequels, on record scale come to that, it cannot be denied that CGI effects were pride of place for the new trilogy. In fact, it was after seeing ILM's CGI work on Jurassic Park in 1993 that finally convinced Lucas to return to his far, far away galaxy. But why is Steven Spielberg's masterpiece Jurassic Park, a film that effectively oversaw the death of mainstream traditional high-speed go-motion animation, used to great effect during the original trilogy in scenes like the Battle of Hoth and the Rancor attack, and heralded the arrival of photoreal CGI creatures, the likes of which still loom large even 30 years later, relevant to this story?
An excellent question. Thank you for asking.
In the case of Star Wars, what many people saw as a filmmaking masterpiece in 1977, Lucas saw as a mere percent of what he wanted. Despite the groundbreaking special effects that shocked and awed the world, effects that were quite literally conceived for the film that had never been done before, Lucas could see all the metaphoric tape holding everything together.
He always said things like, if I could wave my magic wand, I would put electrodes in my head and have the movie made right there.
Even with the advances between A New Hope, Empire, and Return of the Jedi, Lucas never fully felt that the technology of the day was capable of delivering on his vision, feeling like he'd ultimately settled for good enough rather than what he actually wanted.
Which is, there were various things, especially in the original film, that I wasn't satisfied with. Special effects shots that never really were finished, scenes that hadn't, that I wanted to include that couldn't have been included for some reason, mostly money and time.
What the world saw as innovative and stunning, Lucas saw as a crude, scrappy B film, a rudimentary space fairy tale. It was only after mixing the audio on Jurassic Park, as a favour to Spielberg while Steven was conducting principal photography for Schindler's List in Europe, that Lucas became convinced that CGI technology might finally be up to the task for realising his vision for Star Wars, which first meant going back to the original trilogy to prove that point to himself. This is the beginning of the prequel divide for many, the changes included in the Star Wars Trilogy Special Edition of 1997. While the younger audience that was being introduced to Star Wars for the first time did not see any issues with the new inclusions, for obvious reasons, not all the older generations of Star Wars fans enjoyed the changes. And with the fairest possible shake, it's easy to understand why, given that these fans were responsible for the success of the original films when they first screened. The changes were primarily superficial in nature and really didn't add anything of substance to the narrative. Things like a CGI Jabba the Hutt that didn't look remotely like his Return of the Jedi counterpart, and even less so in 1997, Greedo shooting first instead of Han and somehow missing at point-blank range, and an extended musical sequence in Jabba's palace that replaced the original music, and assorted CGI background fillers being the focus of the backlash. Compounding these changes, Lucas stated that he would not be releasing the original negative of the film again, confirming that the VHS collection released in 1995 would be the last of the theatrical versions of the films. For Lucas, the changes in the special editions were intended to make the trilogy the definitive version of his story, even though additional changes were made again in 2004 and 2011 for both the DVD and Blu-ray releases, the latter adding additional prequel references. This is a point of contention as many consider the theatrical releases of the original trilogy to be the definitive Star Wars films, inclusive of the original effects that won multiple Academy Awards. To many, George's changes were robbing the original of some of its magic. What's key here is George's need and desire to have things the way he envisioned. I'm not condemning or defending here, just stating the reasoning from the man himself.
At some point, a famous filmmaker said, films are never completed, they're only abandoned. And rather than living with my abandoned movie, I really wanted to go back and complete it.
If I was, however, to offer some salty conjecture, I feel a lot of the issues fans have with the special editions would be resolved if Lucasfilm just released a HD remaster of the theatrical cuts, in all their raw glory, allowing fans to pick and choose which version of the film they'd rather see. The closest thing we currently have to this are the 2006 DVD bonus discs, which are a rip from the 1993 Laserdisc version. Close, but not a true HD unaltered original.
Why, you slimy, double-crossing, no-good swindler.
But the point is conceded. Lucas's early experiences with Hollywood cutting his films has led to a protective jealousy of his work, including close hold of the original Star Wars negative, which in his eyes, as its maker, is imperfect. Holy hell, I could go off on an entire tangent about the ownership rights of the original negative because it's a fascinating story in of itself.
You will not deviate from your present course.
Get stuffed, Bespin Cloud Car, you don't tell me what to do. How Fox still owned it up until about 1996 when Lucas wanted to complete a remaster. And then Fox basically traded A New Hope's ownership back to Lucas in a deal to ensure that they got the prequel distribution contract. Ah, Fox, always playing the short-term money game. How's that going for you, buddy?
Stay on target.
Fine. But I guess the question is, after a film hits cinemas and is released to the general public, does the filmmaker still own it, or does it now belong to the fans?
Harder to answer. Meditate on this. I will.
But for better or worse, Lucas re-released the original trilogy with the digital changes, stating that, as the creator of Star Wars, they were now the way he wanted them to look. The CGI advances thereof a proof of concept for the Phantom Menace, the first Star Wars film that would see Lucas not only with full creative control of the story, but also over the technical restrictions that had plagued his work in the past.
Star Wars itself was written very, very carefully around the technology I had, that I could make the movie.
Ultimately constraining his writing to work within those limitations. But, as of 1996, he could effectively release the reins on his creativity.
So it begins.
The Phantom Menace, a film that arguably highlights the best and worst of George's storytelling tendencies and signalled his return to the director's chair for the first time since 1977. At one end of the spectrum, we have some long-awaited non-EU Star Wars world building officially declared by the creator, including galactic politics, the Jedi Order, trade and economics, as well as the introduction of characters that would become fan favourites. To the other end, where we have childish toilet humour and CGI slapstick, great costumes but with clinical expository dialogue, new Jedi and an E.T. cameo, but also Baby Greedo. We have arguably John Williams' best work since The Empire Strikes Back and the accompanying Duel of Fates lightsaber battle. But we also have what some people refer to as a 14-minute toy commercial in the middle of the film. While a homage to George's love of racing, speed and action wrapped up in the Star Wars mise-en-scene, it is still at the mercy of a younger-than-expected Anakin Skywalker who is already a great pilot. A relatively simple plot that loses itself in the wide world-building net being woven, and a finale with 4 plot climaxes intercut to the point of confusion.
It's bold in terms of jerking people around, but I may have gone too far in a few places.
In a space of about 90 seconds, you go from lamenting the death of, a hero, to escape, to slightly comedic with Jar Jar, to Anakin returning with his little kind of tag. It's a lot.
We have newly innovated CGI that placed the first fully realised digital actor in a film, but also we have problematic race stereotypes and anti-Semitic caricature in those character designs. Okay, I'm sick of hearing that critique, and people that look for problems of that nature have spent too much time inside a college-university bubble, whether current year or in 1999. Thus, they have a fetish of perpetual victimhood and likely confirmation bias for good measure. George is not anti-Semitic, nor is he racist. Look who his best friend is, look who he handpicked to design the prequels, and look who he is married to. Not to mention the many films that he championed that Hollywood flat out refused to support due to the marketability of their subject matter. And I'm sure the reason Disney Star Wars never took off in China is completely unrelated.
I was not aware of such failure.
Clumsy execution? Yes, I'll concede that. Deliberate racism? I don't think so, but feel free to at me. Moving on. Due to the potential of the newly emerged possibilities afforded by CGI, Lucas was hyper-fixated on pushing the digital bar, which meant that the story and CGI tools, not unlike the analog special effects of the OT, were joined at the hip, particularly in regards to digital characters. We'll discuss story and characters in more detail later, with one immediate exception, as the character's existence is tied to the CGI CGI technology underpinning the Phantom Menace, and appropriately enough, is an often cited point of contention within Episode 1, and not without good reason.
Jar Jar Binks.
We all knew this was coming. I cannot do a video on people's dislike for the prequels without mentioning 1999's Critics' Choice for favourite metaphoric punching bag. A character that lives in infamy amongst older fans and critics alike for being a... what did that article call him again? Oh yes, Caribbean Elmo and Rastafarian Roger Rabbit.
She can't do that. Shoot her or something.
While a groundbreaking technical marvel, this character was the Ewok line between younger and older Star Wars fans. Generally speaking, children loved Jar Jar, but the cross-section of fans that had been waiting 16 years for a new Star Wars movie, not so much. His childlike innocence, slapstick comedy, and quote-unquote unintelligible accent, the bane of everyone over the age of 12. Worse still, he was persistent throughout the film, including tying him into the 4-part climax as a general leading the Gungan droid battle, creating significant tonal whiplash when compared to the climax of Return of the Jedi, which was also child-friendly in 1980. What can I say? The 80s were a different time. While Jar Jar's presence in The Phantom Menace was a deliberate focus for Lucas, and a CGI feat that was simply impossible at the time of the original trilogy,
Jar Jar is a key to all this. If we get Jar Jar working, because he's a funnier character than we've ever had in any of the movies before.
One that served his purpose in the eyes of the creator, he's also the best illustration of creator intent versus execution when it collides with audience expectations. He was technically possible, yes, but not what older fans were expecting or wanting. This should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway because I know someone will bring it up in the comments. I personally have the utmost respect for Ahmad Best's performance, and believed that he was ultimately treated terribly by critics and fans alike. He deserved better, and I'm not going to throw any more shade at him.
You bow to no one.
The point. When people say that there is too much CGI in the prequels, I think what they're actually saying is the look of the prequels is vastly different from the original trilogy because of the CGI being the focus, rather than complementary to the story. And look, they're not wrong. The comparisons between A New Hope and The Phantom Menace are night and day, and creator intent is key here. For A New Hope, Lucas wanted to make a classic Hollywood movie with sound stages, sets and costumes. The fantastical special effects could only be achieved with composite models on wires, meaning that all the elements of A New Hope are very tangible for both the actors and audience. Unlike on The Phantom Menace, where he wanted to create as close to a fully realised digital movie as possible, including characters, environments, sequences, and even the post-production process. To that end, it was a deliberate choice by Lucas to make the prequels look and feel different both in terms of aesthetic design and visual execution, which is something of a theme in his work that he's always trying something different to improve on or make something completely new. Lucas is a natural innovator. Sometimes it works, and sometimes not. So much so, segue, that when he saw how little innovation there was, both in terms of story, world building, and filmmaking advancement in The Force Awakens, he breached his non-disparage agreement with Disney.
Disney, who was a little nervous. You know, one of the issues was the first 3 movies had all kinds of issues. They looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. So I said, all I want to do is tell a story of what happened. You know, it started here and it went there. And it's all about generations, and it's about, you know, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers, and it's a family soap opera.
Among the last things we negotiated before the deal closed was a non-disparagement clause. I asked George to agree that he wouldn't publicly criticize any of the Star Wars films we made. Shortly after the release, though, an interview George had done a few weeks earlier with Charlie Rose aired. George talked about his frustration that we hadn't followed his outlines and said that selling to Disney was like selling his children to white slavers. It was an unfortunate and awkward way for him to describe the feeling of having sold something that he considered his children. I decided to stay quiet and let it pass. There was nothing to be gained from engaging in any public discourse or waging a defense. All of the negotiations, over the money, and then over the question of his ongoing involvement with Star Wars, were exercises in balancing my respect for what George had done, and how deeply personal I knew this was for him, with my responsibility to the company. I could empathize with George, but I couldn't give him what he wanted.
He was deceived by a lie. We all were.
For the first time in his directorial career, Lucas was not restricted by the technical limitations of traditional special effects, meaning he could truly lean in on what was unachievable in the original trilogy and omissions that still bothered him even after the release of the special editions. More elaborate locations, new otherworldly aliens, creatures and droids that were not restricted to anthropomorphic actors in masks and hand-operated puppets. The original trilogy looks the way it does in no small part because of the technical limitations of the special effects of the day, which evidently bothered Lucas. Sprinkling some salt, I would wager that the original trilogy would have looked completely different if digital filmmaking had been a thing in the 70s and 80s. And while I can't say that with assurance without speaking to George Lucas, we'll call it an educated guess gleamed by the added scenes in the lead up to the Death Star assault in A New Hope, the new establishing shots on Bespin in Empire, and the inclusion of Coruscant in Jedi. There are also several scenes in the prequels that pay heavy homage to shots from the original trilogy, suggesting how they may have looked under different technological circumstances. Would that mean that the original trilogy was less well received if CGI had been the primary delivery of their special effects? But I'm sure you can see my point. If Lucas had had the power then, he would have done it that way. But without a parallel universe gateway, there is no way to tell how crowds would have received the originals if they'd been delivered with the same technology as the prequels. What we do know with some assurance is that while the target audience for the prequels, 12-year-olds, had no issue with the use of CGI, the older fans that had waited 16 years between Jedi and Phantom, complete with their adult biases and expectations, were naturally hoping for some visual consistency, thus taking issue with the use of CGI and Jar Jar specifically. The visual disparity between trilogies remains an issue to this day, and is one of the few points in favour of the Disney sequels.
How could you even say that?
Which initially drew in audiences with its faithful adherence to the OT aesthetic, which is a bit of an irony when George contends that Star Wars is one film that should be watched as a single story, given the jarring juxtaposition between CGI and traditional special effects. That is the only bone I'm going to throw Disney in this video, and once again,
I hope you choke on it!
But I digress. The digital shots that work best in The Phantom Menace, and when I say best, I mean the ones that are most consistent with the original trilogy, are the miniatures that are enhanced with digital overlays, or shots that are dark and can therefore mask some of the uncanny valley effect the human eye experiences when looking at CGI. Cinematography of this nature is one of the many reasons the CGI of Jurassic Park has aged so well, because darkness, fog, and rain can hide the flaws of a CGI element, something that is much harder to disguise in the middle of a grassy field in broad daylight. But Lucas wasn't interested in hiding the magic in Phantom. He wanted CGI centre stage, to push the boundaries of the new technology to breaking point. So for every underwater village shot, there is also a Windows XP background. And while he achieved his intent with digital execution, laying the groundwork for the digital cinema revolution, it was at the cost of what many older fans were expecting from a story and character perspective. Don't worry, we'll get into that in due course. Even so, I would contend that the CGI in The Phantom Menace has fared reasonably well in retrospect, courtesy of a reliance on physical sets, miniatures, and digital matte paintings. I would submit that the real issues with CGI started when actors were placed against blue and green screens with no real references for their performances to act or react to, creating a lack of tangibility for them and the audience. Something that was done sparingly in The Phantom Menace, which still leveraged on-location shooting as well as traditional sound stages due to the lack of filmmaking experience with CGI, but started in earnest with Attack of the Clones. So, if The Phantom Menace was a tentative step into the world of digital special effects, Attack of the Clones was a running leap through a window. With George once again in the director's chair, the film doubled down on CGI action, sets, actors, Yoda, and dialogue.
I'm haunted by the kiss.
This is the worst!
Attack of the Clones is widely considered to be the worst of the Star Wars films.
Impossible. Perhaps the archives are incomplete.
Which may no longer be true, but is arguably still the least popular of the prequels and the worst of George Lucas's Star Wars films collectively. Namely, because of the juxtaposition of CGI spectacle against wooden performances. Where I could mount a defense of The Phantom Menace against those who say that its CGI effects have aged poorly, I cannot with Attack of the Clones, despite personally enjoying the film. I can't recall why.
I just died on your arms tonight.
Attack of the Clones has all the problems of the Phantom Menace, but amplified due to an ever-growing list of innovative CGI shots that, when contrasted against the physical actors on set, in retrospect, don't look great. Less physical sets were used during the production of Episode 2, and while this was an aesthetic stretch goal from Lucas, there is also a technical reason as to why. Attack of the Clones was the first Hollywood blockbuster to be shot with digital cameras, and not the traditional 35mm celluloid cameras like the ones used on the original trilogy. In fact, Lucas wanted to shoot the entire prequel trilogy digitally, but the Sony Panavision prototypes were not ready come principal photography on the Phantom Menace. Because of the higher definition available from these digital cameras, there were concerns that traditional miniatures would not be workable, as the camera would betray all the construction flaws normally masked on 35mm. While this ultimately proved untrue, the solution, at least to George's mind, was to have ILM recreate the originally proposed miniature sets, like the Colosseum, digitally. This was a floodgate moment, as it widened George's creative world-building net, and thus he ceased chasing the immaculate realism that defined the aesthetic of the original trilogy in favour of digital spectacle. Of the roughly 2,000 visual effects shots in Attack of the Clones, only about 100 of them are free from CGI. For perspective, A New Hope only has around 360 effect shots in the whole film, and only a couple of them are digital. I'm not saying that Clones doesn't have chef's kiss CGI moments, but the tensions between physical tangibility and digital spectacle were evident with the second prequel installment, which became a perpetual motion machine of more and more ambitious CGI shots. The more George saw, the more he wanted, adding entire digital scenes at the 11th hour, much to the despair of the team at ILM. Attack of the Clones also highlights one of George's key shortcomings as a director, which is a tendency to cut to the chase, foregoing character moments in favour of speed, action and spectacle, which, to George, is the best use of the film medium.
I'm a visual filmmaker as opposed to a literary filmmaker, so the movie doesn't rest in the dialogue. It rests in the visuals.
But while he was forced to slow the pace of the films down on Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi due to the technical restrictions of the day, generating a necessity for quieter character moments influenced by Irvin Kershner, Richard Marquand, and even some of the actors, the freedom CGI afforded him working on the prequels allowed him to star wipe to the next set piece and action thereof, often at the cost of those character-driven scenes. In turn, making the scenes he did choose to slow down and focus on in Episode 2 all the more jarring when compared to the sheer amount of CGI spectacle surrounding them. Attack of the Clones is also a victim of CGI comparison from its contemporaries, ironically because of the innovations made by ILM on the Phantom Menace.
The real point is how can we manage to change the operating procedures in a way that we can completely revolutionize the way we make movies so that this is all doable? Because it's not just that we have to do it for this picture, we have to do it for 2 more pictures, and also if this picture works, then everybody also wants it done for their picture.
And do it they did. Between the release of Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, we saw the release of The Fellowship of the Ring and Harry Potter, the latter being the beneficiary of ILM, and both films being shot on 35mm celluloid, both of which sought to use CGI to enhance or complement physical sets and locations, or add impossibly fantastical creatures, rather than building completely alien worlds in the computer, making Attack of the Clones CGI look uncanny even at the time of release. While it would not be fair to say that the CGI in Episode 2 is bad, full stop, end of argument, I've always maintained that the human eye is more forgiving of CGI elements when they are used in tandem with other filmmaking techniques to enhance a scene, rather than being the champion of the shot. But to be fair, the inherent "that's fake" one experiences when they see an actor contrasted against a sanitized green or blue screen is a problem that still exists to this day, with very few directors being capable of producing something that looks and feels real within those limitations. Despite Episode 2 beginning the true digital revolution of cinema in Hollywood, much of the spectacle was at the cost of plausibility, with our heroes often saved by a CGI sleight of hand, and a little too much plot convenience. To this day, the film is marred for its reliance on CGI over traditional effects, ultimately becoming a digital showcase, rather than the focused, character-driven story that many fans were hoping for in the wake of The Phantom Menace, despite George's attempt at a romance with Anakin and Padme's love story. Credit where credit is due though, Lucas did completely dial back on Jar Jar in Attack of the Clones. Well, apart from him being a rather significant tool in the rise of Emperor Palpatine, which to this day I'm convinced happened as a response to the critics' reaction to Jar Jar in The Phantom Menace. But again, a pinch of salt with that one if you please. That said, the story of CGI doesn't end here.
More? More did you speak?
If there are any positives that can be unanimously accepted when it comes to the CGI of the prequels, it's that Revenge of the Sith was firing on all digital cylinders when it hit screens in 2005. While both Clones and Sith were shot on the same digital cameras, the revolution of the technology and the experience behind the scenes was plain for all to see. Attack of the Clones stumbled, so Revenge of the Sith could run. Cinematographer David Tattersall and ILM learned from the flat, clinical look of Attack of the Clones and lit Revenge of the Sith with more contrast and shadow. Scenes like conversations with the Jedi Council went from a sterile room full of chairs in broad daylight to ominous war rooms with darkness and shadow, complementing the theme of the film and visually underscoring the desired tone. On a purely visual level, Revenge of the Sith delivers the prequel's most breathtaking action and grandeur, which, while attempted in its predecessors, never quite hit the mark. No place is this more evident than the opening battle over Coruscant, as it is a culmination of technical development from ILM, throwing everything at the scene, including the kitchen sink. Revenge of the Sith also saw a massive improvement in digital colour grading and the use of artificial lighting. The climactic duel between Anakin and Obi-Wan on Mustafar is a particular standout. Furious, brilliantly choreographed, that did verge on excessive at some points, with the blue blades popping in contrast to the environment. But left many feeling that it was more flash than substance and detracted from the emotional core of the fight. Unlike the slower, more deliberate fight in Return of the Jedi between Luke and Vader, where each strike felt it carried emotional resonance and significance. Advanced compositing methods enabled ILM to better integrate digital characters and backgrounds with live-action plates, the champion of this achievement being General Grievous, a fully digital character including cloth cape with photoreal physics that seamlessly interacted with real actors and physical sets. Where Clones often relied on full CGI backgrounds that looked floaty or disconnected from their human actors, Revenge of the Sith used more partial sets that were enhanced with digital set extensions. This meant that the actors had real elements to interact with, and the CGI environments had a better sense of scale, perspective, and texture. And that tangibility is worth its weight in gold, not just for the actors, but also to sell their performances to the audience. With the hybrid approach ultimately feeling much more grounded than the all-digital green blue screen sets used in Clones. In short, Lucas and ILM had found their feet in the new world of digital cinema during Revenge of the Sith, which is probably a driving factor as to why it is the least mired of the prequel trilogy. Aesthetically, it is the closest, visually speaking, to the original trilogy, and also for the fact that Jar Jar doesn't utter a single word of dialogue in the film. Watch it.
Excuse me.
But even though it was a dramatic improvement over the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, as well as a technological culmination for ILM, the use of CGI in place of traditional special effects was still a sticking point for many. The visuals too dynamic, too intangible, too complex, too different, and too removed from the emotional stakes of the film. Ultimately, the use of CGI is just one skin-deep factor in this discussion, even without the amplification of, at the time, incomparable expectations. The meat and bones of people's dislike for the prequels, however, lies within the actual story, and by extension, its characters and their dialogue. So let's dive a little deeper. I appreciate that up until this point I may have sounded a bit like a Lucas apologist, and have probably been overly fair to his creative intent given the title of the video. So thank you for your patience if that has been annoying you, but I will now rescind George's protected status and take the gloves off as I ask the hard questions, starting with, did George Lucas have more control over the prequels than he did on the original trilogy? Hence their many issues. Well, I don't wish to be a bubble burster, but Lucas was an editorial overseer for each of the Star Wars films of his tenure, and had final cut on 5 of them, meaning the last say of what was put to screen, and this includes the widely praised Empire Strikes Back. While not the sole editor and writer, he was the primary creative force on both fronts, mixing and editing each film closely with the principal editor, and sometimes by himself, for each film. Seriously, Lucas straight up fired the first editor on Star Wars A New Hope, before beginning to cut the film himself. Then, given the tenuous post-production situation of the film at ILM, he enlisted the help of his wife at the time, Marsha, and subsequently hired Richard Chew and Paul Hirsch to assist with the final cut. I could go off on a whole tangent about that, because there's countless hours of archival footage of Lucas sitting in the editing room with and without the primary editor on all 6 films, which directly contradict the notion that he had less control over the original trilogy. He's also on record stating that he prefers the editorial and mixing process over that of directing and writing.
Francis's real expertise is in the theater, working with actors, and as a writer and a screenwriter. The 2 things I hate, especially in those days. I didn't even think they were, valid in any way. So all I cared about was editing and photography. So that was my area of expertise.
Worse still, there are too many uncorroborated and frankly blatant lies on the topic.
So what you're saying is George Lucas has a limited mental focus, a limited intelligence. This kind of goes into the subject of what's wrong with his brain.
Well, although, I mean, I think if you look at, you look at Graffiti and THX and the original Star Wars, I thought they were pretty well-directed films,
They're well-edited films.
Finished?
What?
Are you finished?
Uh-huh.
Don't put it away.
No.
Put your hands up on the wall.
Okay.
Usually downplaying George Lucas himself while overestimating Marshall Lucas's influence on A New Hope. That Lucas somehow wasn't the principal creator of the original trilogy, or that the prequels were populated with yes men that refused to critique George's story, some of which have amassed hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube alone. I'm not saying that Marshall Lucas, Chew, and Hirsch don't deserve due credit for editing A New Hope. After all, their Academy Awards reflect that. Neither am I saying that Irvin Kershner and Richard Marquand don't deserve recognition for their direction of actors during Empire and Jedi, nor that Lawrence Kasdan, Lee Brackett, and Gary Kurtz didn't influence the final screenplays. But the narrative that Star Wars somehow wasn't Lucas's work, but rather a reflection of a few secret artists that history has forgotten about, is simply incorrect. George didn't have less control over the original trilogy. He had limitations and restrictions for what was technically possible, writing his screenplays accordingly, as well as both deliberate and incidental collaborations during the writing process with various sources, naturally including the woman he shared a bed with. In 1997, the Pandora's box of CGI was well and truly opened, and those limitations were gone, freeing up his writing.
That was the fun part of writing this project, is that I wasn't limited. Whatever my imagination could come up with, I just put down on the page, and I said, we'll worry about this later.
But so were many of his personal writing soundboards to bounce his ideas off, including his wife. He also wasn't cold forging the story this time, meaning he didn't feel the need to deliberately collaborate with a co-writer, because he knew the end state, and in his mind he was simply expanding on the backstory, writing his Silmarillion to his Lord of the Rings, if you will. So while I concede he sought more assistance with the writing process on the original trilogy than he did with the prequels, I do not agree that he had less control of the actual writing, other than the constraints he placed upon himself.
When I did Star Wars, the whole project was an exercise in reining myself in and designing a film to be able to get the maximum amount of strange environment and exciting spaceship action out of very, very little. I don't really have to rein myself in anymore.
But we've discussed the point of technology underpinning creative constraints and limitations already. So,
next question!
Did the prequel story meet fan expectation?
Oh, boy.
Let's state the obvious. For the most part, Phantom Menace was not the story original trilogy fans were expecting or hoping to see when it hit theaters in 1999. And this is where creator intent and execution truly collide with fan expectation. Remaining within the scope and ignoring any potential expanded universe bias, in the first instance, I'm sure OG original trilogy fans were hoping for a continuation of Han, Luke and Leia's story. And with the benefit of box office hindsight from The Force Awakens, I think it's fair to say that that is true.
You know, that's the great thing, is I don't think you have to have seen the 6 other movies to enjoy this.
What the fuck is wrong with you?
However, once Lucas committed to telling a prequel trilogy that focused on how Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, I'm sure the story most fans were expecting in terms of Anakin's fall, and particularly in their first installment, probably looked a little something like Obi-Wan's speeches to Luke in A New Hope and Return of the Jedi.
That's what your uncle told you. He didn't hold with your father's ideals, thought he should have stayed here and not gotten involved.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father. Anakin was a good friend. When I first knew him, your father was already a great pilot, but I was amazed how strongly the Force was with him. I took it upon myself to train him as a Jedi.
So based on this information, that looks like a story told during the height or start of the Clone Wars, with Obi-Wan and an Anakin that was the brother of Owen and not a mythical Force baby, and was probably older than the age of 10 when he decided to join the Crusade, rather than a child slave with an uncanny ability to pilot Ben-Hur chariots strapped to jet engines. I say this with confidence based on the many reviews I've read from 1999, some from mainstream critics and others from humble fan web pages. Regardless of their origin, the majority of them mention the lack of a Han Solo character. character, and many suggest that Phantom would have been greatly improved if Anakin had been a teenager, similar in age to when audiences first met Luke. There are a few reasons for this, but chiefly it's because the fans that had grown up with the original films were now adults themselves, and hoping for something more mature to reflect their preferences, making the fan favourite dashing rogue Solo-esque character the logical choice to lead a new and more mature trilogy. It's also important to caveat that, while the internet was a thing in the late 90s, social media was not, meaning that online opinions were not so prolific or always reflective of the general audience's views. Usually reserved for mainstream and access media film critics, or internet-savvy Star Wars fans that were old enough and capable enough of generating their own web pages or navigating early internet forums. One can imagine the age and demographic of that kind of fan. Hardly a holistic cross-section, not that their opinions should be discounted. However, the widely accepted notion that all fans hated the prequels at the time of release may not be as factual as many would have you believe. I personally remember the reception by older fans to the films being quite favourable in Australia, particularly with Clones and Sith, as they were filmed at Fox Studios in Sydney. But that is biased conjecture on my part. What we do know was there was backlash, but the level is hard to determine. Another important caveat is that fans, regardless of age, were not coming into the trilogy cold as they had in 1977. Story conventions, style and tone had all been established in the original trilogy, a spectrum that covered charred human remains to cuddly Ewoks, which is a fairly wide lane in which to remain tonally consistent, and one of the original trilogy's greatest achievements is that consistency. Even The Empire Strikes Back, the darkest entry in the trilogy, remains hopeful, flawlessly melding together romance, action-adventure and comedy into a single consistent tone. The prequels, however, struggle. The Phantom Menace veers from grim politicking to slapstick comedy. Attack of the Clones is torn between noir, mystery, war epic and romance, never managing to balance all three. Revenge of the Sith finally embraces operatic tragedy, but the tonal whiplash of the earlier films blunts its impact. The original trilogy's tone feels unified, whereas the prequels feel uncertain about their identity, and when the 6 films are combined, that disparity in tone grows. While George has always maintained that the original trilogy were children's films, there is no denying that there are some very dark moments in the first film. Grim scenes that are not visually depicted with the same weight until Revenge of the Sith. So I guess the question that many were asking when they first saw The Phantom Menace, and still ask to this day, is why was Anakin written as a 9-year-old to start the trilogy, when teenage Anakin seemed like the logical choice? Why was the tone so much lighter than the original trilogy, inclusive of childish toilet humour? And why was Jar Jar centre stage? Well, the answer is simple enough. George's stories are a reflection of him at the time of writing. No more, no less. In 1977, George saw the world through the eyes of Luke Skywalker. Young, inexperienced, hopeful, a little naive, and a countercultural product of the 50s and 60s. A man yearning to find his place in the world, topple the evil empire with the tools he had available, and overcome the shadow of his father. Like most young men, Lucas had angst about the world, and in the late 60s, early 70s, his frustrations centered on the Vietnam War and authoritarian control. But having learned from the commercial failure of THX 1138, a tonally grim film in which he aired some of these frustrations, that the world wouldn't respond to his message if he couldn't make them care, he couched his new space fantasy as a simple, wholesome, family-friendly fairy tale. A clearly framed story of rebellious hope against authoritarian tyranny that remained accessible to all ages, perfectly capturing the cultural zeitgeist of the post-Vietnam era. That was a refreshing break from the hard-edged films of the 60s and 70s. In 1997, George saw the world through the eyes of Qui-Gon, the master who knew better. Not in lockstep with the establishment, he wanted to expand and recontextualize his galaxy, to unfurl the mysteries that defined the mythos. While he still had real-world concerns he wanted to explore, the edge and angst that had defined his earlier films had softened in his 50s, likely a result of his time as a father. This also explains the attempts to simplify complex concepts, like politics and the Republic, the way a father would explain such matters to a curious child, not yet capable of fully comprehending the concept. Because of this, the prequels become a contradiction of conflicting ideas and a tale of unconscious bias, both on Lucas's part and on behalf of the audience. George's bias means that they are targeted at a younger audience, but the existing audience were now adults with their own mature expectations. The films were lighter in tone in the beginning, but the conflicts within them are grey and morally complex, and not as black and white as they were in the original trilogy. While Lucas now better understood his galaxy, he'd lose his narrative focus trying to reconcile his desire to tell a more nuanced and complex story, combining genres and inverting traditional character arcs, with that of a father's perspective of endeavouring to keep things simple and child-friendly for a younger audience. This internal conflict between a talented filmmaker who is now a decade out of practice writer-directing, now seeking to expand his repertoire, and that of a father determined to please his own children, all while seemingly ignoring the concerns of his pre-established fans.
What the hell are you talking about?
A choice was made in favour of youth, and for those who did not embrace it,
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy!
Also, if I was to be a little cynical, as a shrewd businessman, there is an argument to be made that Lucas focused on the younger demographic, not just because of his own children, but also due to the potential of massive toy sales for Lucasfilm. Star Wars dominated toy sales from 1997 to 1999 with the release of the Star Wars Special Editions and then the Phantom Menace. Before Lucas sold Star Wars, he is estimated to have made close to $14 billion in toy sales alone. But I'll let you be the judge of the intent on that front.
You must do what you feel is right, of course.
What was originally intended to deftly tell the tragedy of Darth Vader as the hero's fall and the thematic inverse of Luke Skywalker's hero's journey, that more clearly framed Vader's redemption in Return of the Jedi, was readily influenced by Lucas's personal life experiences as a single father, which in The Phantom Menace manifest as a young queen similar in age to his daughter, a young Anakin similar in age to his son, and his concerns about the current state of affairs facing the United States in the 2000s.
Our nation is at war. Our economy is in recession, and the civilized world faces unprecedented dangers. Yet the state of our union has never been stronger.
Combine this additional thematic baggage with a creative urge to showcase emerging digital technology, enabling George's tendency to accelerate to the next set piece at the expense of character development, and we have the imperfect foundation upon which George's prequel story is built. One of exposition and external action, including Jar Jar, that loses itself amidst the growing lore and world building, rather than a character-driven drama, and is, as a result, a victim of internal comparison. When George released Star Wars in 1977, few could have imagined that it would become one of, if not the, most enduring modern myth of the 20th century, least of all George. The original trilogy resonates with audiences to this day not merely because of the groundbreaking special effects, but because it told a timeless story that was simple in delivery, rich in depth, and anchored to the personal experiences and stakes of the characters. The original trilogy is one of, if not the best, modern example of the hero's journey in three-act story structure as captured through the arc of Luke Skywalker. As a study of Joseph Campbell, it was Lucas's intent with Star Wars to create a new coming-of-age story with mythological underpinnings and psychological motifs, exploring the dark themes of THX, but delivered with the youthful energy and general audience-pleasing vibes of American graffiti. Luke embodies the archetypal hero, called from obscurity, mentored, tested, tempted, and finally transformed. His path is clean, universal, and deeply relatable. George was also very aware of his shortcomings as a writer of character and dialogue the first time around, seeking input from Gloria and Willard Huyck, Lawrence Kasdan, and even Marsha to round out the characters and punch up the dialogue, knowing it would be much harder to distract audiences with effects. Not that he didn't try. The result is a semi-collaborative writing process and a trilogy that is anchored on Luke's transformation from farm boy to Jedi Knight, against the backdrop of the galactic civil war. The strength of the original trilogy story lies in its balance between focus of character, clarity of conflict, simplicity of plot, and nuance of themes. The rebels represent freedom, the Empire tyranny. The Force embodies the universal human struggle between light and dark. Luke demonstrates hope, idealism, fear, and the power of choice. Vader personifies both villainy and tragedy, giving the story moral depth while keeping the stakes crystal clear. It's binary and simple, light and dark, good and evil, rebels versus Empire, and the outward and inward struggle between the two parties. More than this, the battle of good and evil becomes personal and character focused. The external action, although spectacular, is less important and relatable than the battle between light and dark occurring within the protagonist and antagonist. It's a textbook case study of how to invest your audience in the stakes for a character's conflict, by making them personal and empathetic. Everyone, despite age, sex, race, colour or creed, can relate to Luke Skywalker staring at the sunset on Tatooine, yearning for more and wishing they could be somewhere else. By contrast, the prequels present an inverted myth, the fall of a hero. Anakin's descent into Darth Vader has the bones of a Greek tragedy, but its execution is inconsistent, unfocused, and impersonal. George cared about young Anakin, that much is clear, but failed to make the audience care. The closest scene we have to the binary sunset in A New Hope, in The Phantom Menace, is when Anakin leaves his mother, which, while generating sympathy, in no small part thanks to John Williams' music, is not the same as empathy. This is a problem if you're trying to tell a story of how a good character turns bad. Pathos only lands if the audience is invested. Unless Unless it's scored by John Williams, of course, then you can get away with a lot. George shows us Anakin is good and tells us he's struggling with his internal conflicts, but we don't really feel it the way we did with Luke. So when his turn to the dark side comes, it lacks emotional weight due to that lack of audience investment. And this is in part because the clear nuanced binary state of the galaxy in the original trilogy, good rebels and Luke versus evil Empire and Vader, that served the themes of choice, hope, friendship and legacy, are not so cut and dry in the prequels, nor are they anchored to the principal character's internal journey. The prequels lean on external political intricacy and Republic machinations, rather than character-led notions of good and evil to drive the action, stakes and plot. Trade disputes, Senate votes and constitutional crises dominate, with the once declared noble Jedi Knight pawns to a failing democracy, more bureaucrats than warrior monks. The morality of the galaxy is grey. There are heroes on both sides, after all. Not a problem in principle, but definitely removed from the simple terms of its forebear, while also lacking the same character intimacy and unity of themes. As a result, the dramatic fights across the trilogy have spectacle, but lack the character-defining significance of the original trilogy. The Phantom Menace's duel of the fates between Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan and Darth Maul remains one of the saga's most iconic battles, but its significance to Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship is academic rather than organic, despite arguably being causational, courtesy of Dangerous Dave's actually explanation. In Attack of the Clones, the Battle of Geonosis gave fans the spectacle of seeing Jedi Knights fighting en masse, and Revenge of the Sith saw the Battle of Utapau. While these set pieces wowed audience visually, they too often felt disconnected from character arcs, existing as showcases for the choreography and technical prowess of classically trained Jedi, with improved visuals rather than emotional storytelling. A clear example of theme and world building at the expense of character-driven story.
What message? The one you've just been playing. The one you're carrying inside your rusty innards.
George had two key themes he wanted to explore during the prequels: how a republic becomes a dictatorship, and how a good person turns evil. One is grand, collective and impersonal, and the other is individual and private. One drives the external plot, the other should drive the story, through the protagonist, and show why it all matters. The former is well captured throughout the three films, from the politicking of Senator Palpatine to become Supreme Chancellor, then playing both sides to build up their forces and commit to war, and then finally enacting emergency powers to remain in office, convincing the Republic that he is the best choice for a secure and free society, thus forming the Empire, which frames the bulk of the external action in the trilogy. Artists' intent met with a little help from Ian McDermott's performance, one of the few actors that really revelled in the prequel material, and while a part of the prequels that most fans can agree was a fine addition, it is plot-driven rather than character-driven, and its connection with Anakin is tenuous and narratively convenient rather than being thematically symbiotic.
Symbionts?
Yes, I suppose we should discuss that while we're here too. In 1999, fans were eager to reconnect with the spirituality and mysticism of the Force. Instead, they were met with a controversial addition to Star Wars lore, midichlorians. While George intended them as a way of grounding the Force in a biological framework, the concept was met with near-immediate backlash, particularly from older fans. The major criticism was that midichlorians demystified the Force. In the original trilogy, both Obi-Wan and Yoda described the Force as a spiritual energy that binds all living things. It was mysterious, transcendent and universal. Anyone could be touched by it. By quantifying it with a blood test, Lucas reduced the Force to something measurable and scientific, with much of the wonder surrounding the Force evaporating. Second, audiences objected to the sense of genetic determinism. The original trilogy suggested that anyone could reach enlightenment. With enough time, discipline and training, Luke the farm boy could become a Jedi Knight. Midichlorians reframed the journey as something you were either born with or without, and your Force potential was numerically quantifiable. This shift from universal potential to exclusive biology clashed with the hopeful themes of what had originally made Star Wars resonate with a wide audience. Third, many felt it was simply just an unnecessary explanation. The Force had worked best when it was left mysterious, and no one had asked for a scientific rationale. Lucas's decision to explain it in detail felt like overworld building, answering a question that no one had posed. The sense of wonder that had defined the original trilogy was diminished the moment it was dissected under a microscope. To be fair, Lucas's intent was not to cheapen the Force. He had envisioned midichlorians as a symbiotic life form akin to mitochondria that allowed beings to commune with the Force. In his eyes, they did not replace the spirituality, but rather provided a biological bridge to it. He wanted to grow and not diminish the mythos, planning to eventually expand on the Force of the Wills in his sequel trilogy. Yet the nuance of his vision was largely lost on audiences in 1999. For fans raised on the original trilogy, the poetry of "The Force will be with you" could not coexist with "your blood test shows a high midichlorian count." Rather than simply answering an unasked question, its inclusion created confusion, raising more questions. Is Force power inherently linked to the number of midichlorians you have? Or do they merely help you channel the Force better if you have a higher count? Is there a minimum requirement to train as a Jedi? Or a max cap? Couldn't the Jedi just blood test the entire Senate to find this all-powerful Sith Lord? Is the will of the Force determinate, or do I have a choice in my destiny? Do they make me subscribe to channels I'm enjoying? The list goes on. The ultimate problem with midichlorians was not that Lucas lacked intention, but rather the implementation totally clashed with the expectations of his audience. They expected the Force to remain mystical, mythic, and unquantifiable. Instead, it became clinical and elitist. Despite Lucas's defense, midichlorians never landed as he'd hoped, and they remain one of the most divisive elements of the prequels, and an excellent example of the tensions between author intent and execution versus the audience's expectations. The latter theme, and arguably what most would have considered to be the thematic focus of the trilogy, given the premise, how a good Anakin turns bad, was sidelined in favour of explanations like these, shifting the narrative focus away from a character-driven story onto peripheral world-building and external action. Where Luke's journey is a steady climb out of fear and temptation into heroic clarity, Anakin's, as an intended inverse, should have been a tragic fall from heroism into temptation, ending in tragedy. But because Anakin is not the focal point of the story, particularly in the beginning, this arc feels unfocused and uneven, alienating audiences who struggle to emotionally invest in a hero that never was. Unlike Luke in A New Hope, Anakin is not the hero of the Phantom Menace. He is a plot device that serendipitously solves two story setbacks. A side character in his own story that doesn't earn the same investment from the audience in his struggle because he doesn't really have one in the first film. Nor is he particularly relatable. Not many 10-year-olds can relate to being a great pilot. Remember, I say this as someone who saw the film as a 9-year-old. For the record, my favourite character was Obi-Wan, as he was for many, which I'll elaborate on shortly. As it stands, the beginning of Anakin's fall does not manifest until Attack of the Clones, which turns Anakin from a delightful, albeit overpowered cherub in Jake Lloyd into an awkward romantic lead played by Hayden Christensen, competing for principal protagonist status against the noir detective Obi-Wan Kenobi played by Ewan McGregor, with both narratives overshadowed by the Senate debates around weaponizing the Republic and the subplot of Jango and Boba Fett's origin, the latter reducing the mystery around one of the OT's most popular side characters. This became a bit of a theme unto itself, with several of the prequel's story inclusions complicating, ignoring, or contradicting points from the original trilogy.
Leia, do you remember your mother? Your real mother?
Just a little bit. She died when I was very young.
Are you sure about that? Generating further questions for things that would have otherwise been a non-issue. But the point of actors is worth discussing because it's a tension of investment for the audience that wasn't a problem in the original trilogy. The OT thrives on clean, satisfying arcs. Mark Hamill's Luke overcomes temptation, fear, and anger to become a Jedi. Harrison Ford's Han transforms from a selfish rogue to a selfless leader. Carrie Fisher's Leia grows from a not-so-distressed damsel that puts the cause first to a rebel leader capable of allowing herself to love. And of course, Vader goes from the Emperor's enforcer to finding redemption in saving his son, all anchored to Luke's journey across the trilogy. The structure builds tension, it's tight, heightens the stakes, and ultimately rewards investment. Catharsis as scored by John Williams. But the key factor here, which I don't often see discussed, is the psychological connection and investment the audience developed with the principal actors, which in the case of Mark and Carrie, quite literally saw them grow up. We were not only invested in the story, we were invested in them, Han, Luke and Leia, as played by Harrison, Mark and Carrie. In the same regard, the prequels struggle. The issue should be apparent by now. The story is not anchored to Hayden Christensen's Anakin and his relationships with Padme and Obi-Wan. Anakin and Obi-Wan's relationship critical here, as it's the only context that we'd been provided for the Clone Wars in the original trilogy. The time jump between Episode 1 and Episode 2, as well as an actor change to accommodate the age difference, basically resetting the audience's investment in Anakin as a character. Thus, the narrative focus feels off, the expected trio character dynamic is missing, and the audience does not build investment in Anakin and Padme, or their relationship, until the second film. This cognitive disconnect between actors, meaning that instead of being endeared to a young Hayden in The Phantom Menace, and the relationship he's established with Padme, and watching it grow into something more profound, like we did with Han and Leia, the audience found this new actor whiny, angsty, and at times creepy in Attack of the Clones, with a vastly different personality and role to play from Jake Lloyd, rather than feeling like a natural evolution of Anakin's character. Which is no fault of Hayden's, might I add, whom was absent absent from the first film and who executed his performance as directed and within the intent of his master. Regardless, the believability of the relationship was a struggle for many because of the time skip and actor change, not helped by the performances that I'll touch on later. So I concur with the early internet consensus vis-a-vis Anakin's age, and believe casting an older Anakin in the Phantom Menace played by Christensen, whom would have been roughly the same age as Natalie Portman, would have added more credibility to their relationship and blossoming romance. A relationship that all but comes from left field in Attack of the Clones because it's part of the plot foundation of the original trilogy, rather than occurring organically for the characters. On that note, while I believe anyone could fall in love with Natalie Portman at first sight, I don't necessarily buy into it with Hayden.
I truly, deeply love you.
I don't like sand.
The change would have also made him a more plausible pilot, adding credence to the concerns of the Jedi Council surrounding his age and advanced skills, and remained consistent with Obi-Wan's comments in the original trilogy. It also would have made his choice to leave his mother and join the Jedi Order all the more tragic, because it would have been a personally conflicting, albeit deliberate decision made by an adult, rather than a passively ignorant and naive one made by a child, thereby making the consequences of the decision all the more impactful. And, most importantly, would have established the audience character connection in the first film of the prequels that was so key in the original trilogy. The terrible irony of all this, particularly around the rushed, awkward and seemingly implausible romance between Anakin and Padme in Attack of the Clones, is that it is the victim of George's contradiction in thinking between pre-existing and new target audience. Many slower scenes, including those developing Padme's feelings for Anakin, as well as her prowess and intentions within the Senate, were cut from the films, sometimes as fully realised scenes in order to accelerate the plot and not risk boring the audience with a lack of action. George's strength as an editor and general audience pleaser trumping his storytelling instincts. But let's face it, while prequel defenders and Andor fans decry the loss of these scenes today, it was probably the right call at the time, given that there were many complaints about too much talking and politics when they originally released. Ironically, from the pre-established fans rather than the new target audience. There is also an argument to be made that as a divorcee and single parent, George had lost the feminine soundboard in his life and thus from his work. As Marcia had been a collaborator of influence on George's previous films, I suspect many of these personal scenes may have remained in favour of others. Not necessarily because she would have been an editor on the film, but because as creative people living together, they would have discussed the story in private. The head and the heart and all that. However, this is conjecture on my part, and I don't buy into the whole Marcia saved Star Wars in the edit thing. Follow the link below if that is of interest to you. The same can be said for Anakin's relationship with Obi-Wan, who do not properly interact until Attack of the Clones, which isn't helped by some Lucas Hall of Fame clunky dialogue.
Good call, my young Padawan.
It's not until the final film and the rescue of Chancellor Palpatine that we begin to see the camaraderie between Anakin and Obi-Wan. But by this point, it was too little too late for a lot of filmgoers, and felt like there was a piece missing between films. More on that later. Relationships between protagonists aside, there is also an antagonist issue throughout the prequels that was not the case in the original trilogy. The OT demonstrated an escalation of principal villain across the three films, but despite the change of top dog between films, Vader remained the principal antagonist and constant for Luke, building audience investment in their conflict across the films. By contrast, the prequels have a revolving door of villains, whom, while all foreshadowing elements of what would become the Emperor's ultimate apprentice in Vader, lose the potential for the same level of audience investment as Vader in the original trilogy. Maul's time is cut short. Dooku is underdeveloped, although you'd never know it when played by Christopher Lee, and General Grievous is a placeholder to give Obi-Wan something to do in the first half of Revenge of the Sith. Yes, I can hear the arguments now.
You don't understand. The Sith apprentice is expendable, showing how cruel their order is. Palpatine always knew Anakin would turn to the dark side. He implies it in the Phantom Menace.
As a fan, I concur with the retrospective sentiments made possible by media like The Clone Wars, but that didn't help general audience investment at the time, nor for those inclined to still give the expanded universe and animated media a miss. It's not necessarily that the fights are flash over substance. There's plenty of thematic depth to be found in the battle between Palpatine and Yoda in the Senate. Generally, the issue is that there's no actual investment in the conflict between the two characters that are fighting. And because of this, the fights lack heart, despite the blood, sweat and tears that went into animating and rehearsing them.
One of the fatal mistakes that almost every science fiction film makes is that they spend so much time on the settings, creating the environment, that they spend film time on it. And you don't have to spend too much film time to create an environment. what they're doing is showing off the amount of work that they generated. And it slows the pace of the film down. And the story is not the settings, the story is the story, it's the plot.
You were the chosen one!
While I concur that Palpatine is the constant antagonistic force of the prequels, he doesn't truly become the principal antagonist, nor meaningfully interact with Anakin until Episode 3. Up until this point, he is rather a driver for the external plot that is not inherently linked to Anakin's arc. Hence the disconnect from the audience upon the revelation of their relationship in Revenge of the Sith. These character connection problems are no small issue and undoubtedly hindered audience investment in Anakin's story. However, they are then amplified when George skips the Clone Wars, arguably the thing fans were looking most forward to, basically cold cutting from their beginning in Attack of the Clones to their final days in Revenge of the Sith. And it is in this gap where many believe the primary issue with the prequel narrative exists. While now filled in by the Clone Wars, the lack of Anakin's Jedi exploits as a guardian of peace and justice, whom's friendship with Obi-Wan was fully established, was missing between 1999 and 2005. Instead, audiences had seen an implausibly competent 10-year-old and an angsty, disobedient, lustful teenager. Hardly the powerful Jedi and good friend described in the original trilogy by Obi-Wan and Yoda. And while we are shown Anakin is special, even by Jedi standards, through some of the more action-driven set pieces in The Phantom Menace, the achievements feel mechanical rather than mythic, lacking the same believability of Luke's trench run in A New Hope, which is, again, probably a victim of Jake Lloyd's age versus Mark Hamill's for comparative feats. Now, believability is not the same as plausibility, as none of Star Wars is considered to be hard science fiction, so I'm not suggesting that Luke's accomplishments in A New Hope are any more or less plausible than Anakin's in The Phantom Menace, particularly where the Force is concerned, but the immersion bubble of fantasy is a delicate thing, requiring character investment and the suspension of disbelief on behalf of the audience. A much harder sell with a 10-year-old than a 19-year-old, even if they are the chosen one. Made tougher again when you change actors between films and focus on the peripheral world building instead of character growth. But the point remains, without seeing Anakin rise to the height of his Jedi powers and thrive at his best alongside Obi-Wan, watching his abrupt turn to the dark side in the third act of the trilogy lacked the same gravitas of Luke's rejection of it. So after many tangents, character shuffles and side quests, all greatly varying in terms of audience investment levels because of the target audience paradox, we finally arrive at the heart of the prequel story, Anakin's seduction to the dark side by Chancellor Palpatine.
Vader was seduced by the dark side of the Force.
In one of the trilogy's most compelling scenes, the Chancellor tells Anakin about Darth Plagueis the Wise. Delivered in hushed tones at the water opera, this moment of dialogue is more haunting than any of the prequel lightsaber duels, and this is because it is one of the few times dialogue isn't used as a matter-of-fact tool of exposition, but rather as subtext, layered with meaning, telling of one character and manipulative of another, servicing both theme and character motivation simultaneously, while also organically enhancing the mythos. All while Palpatine plays on Anakin's fear of losing the thing that he loves the most. Once again, while the groundwork of this fear was laid when Anakin left his mother, its correlation to his relationship with Padme is underdeveloped and unconvincing, as is Sheev's influence and understanding of this fear. In fact, Anakin and Sheev's relationship, which is so central to the creation of Darth Vader, only exists as a couple of throwaway lines and a single conversation in Attack of the Clones. Before, in the space of 4 conversations in Revenge of the Sith, he convinces Anakin to turn on the Jedi. That, while foreshadowing, is probably not proportionate setup given the scale of payoff in Revenge of the Sith. We can only judge what is there on screen, and in this instance, it's a lot of wasted potential and fan extrapolation to justify the actions that follow. What's most frustrating about this, though, is that Revenge of the Sith shows us that George is very capable of writing scenes that develop characters, progress the plot, and weave themes without foot-stomping the moment, as is Hayden and Natalie through their performances. But the water opera and sunset scene on Coruscant before Mace Windu confronts the Chancellor are finite moments of subtlety amidst a trilogy of detractions from these central relationships, meaning that when Anakin finally turns to the dark side, it is cinematically dramatic, yes, but emotionally abrupt. Even if an effective beat-for-beat inversion of Vader's decision to save Luke. In a single night, Anakin becomes complicit in genocide, slaughtering the Jedi younglings, doing so for the sake of the Republic, and in theory to enhance his dark side powers enough to save Padme, the only thing that truly matters to him. But when Padme finally confronts Anakin, theme gets in the way of character motivation. Anakin becomes a corrupted mouthpiece for the dangers of too much power, rather than a powerful but flawed man scared of losing the thing that he loves the most. ultimately pushing them away with his actions. His human fear lost amidst the grandeur of the wider theme of a falling republic, with Padme's death subsequently feeling like a plot mechanic to align with the start of A New Hope, rather than a tragic inevitability of the protagonist's flaw, given that Anakin's desire for power only comes from a place of fear of wanting to protect the things he loves, only to realise he's not just strong enough to influence outcomes, but also control them. In any case, Anakin's abrupt turn on Padme is another driving factor as to why people are a little bit how you going about the prequels, effectively being unable to reconcile the logic and emotion of the scene, given the understanding of their relationship up until this point. Regardless, when Revenge of the Sith premiered in 2005, it was heralded as the darkest and most operatic chapter of George's saga, finally delivering the story fans had been waiting for, the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the birth of Darth Vader. But its power was undercut by the weaknesses of Episode 1 and 2, which failed to lay the emotional groundwork in the form of Anakin's relationships and heroic deeds for the tragedy to fully resonate. Revenge of the Sith is both the triumph and tragedy of the prequel trilogy. It delivers the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the creation of Darth Vader with spectacle and paradoxical pathos, fulfilling decades of fan expectation. But in the same breath, for many fans, Revenge of the Sith succeeds despite its predecessors, not because of them. It stands as the most powerful of the prequels, yet a reminder of what might have been had the setup matched the grandeur of the finale. Hamstrung by the shortcomings of Episode 1 and 2, a child hero that never felt mythic or believable, a romance that never truly convinced, and dialogue that too often failed to connect. While the intent was clear, there is much to be said about its execution. But I guess that's an appropriate segue to talk about the talking. While ropey dialogue is something that is consistent across the saga, when it was combined with George's intent to grow his galaxy in the most expedient and matter-of-fact way possible, usually so he could wipe back to an impressive piece of CGI spectacle, a lot of performances felt awkward when compared to their forebears. And this is in part due to the declarative dialogue which for the most part narrates exposition, rather than feeding subtextual character nuance like in the original trilogy. As a result, there were very few actors that were able to embrace the space opera and deliver organic performances. The few exceptions I have already mentioned. Key plot points in the prequels are almost always stated by a character, rather than being implied through performance, or suggested in subtext.
Not enough power to get us to Coruscant. The hyperdrive is leaking. We'll have to land somewhere to refuel and repair the ship.
The hyperdrive generator's gone, Master. We'll need a new one.
No money, no parts, no deal. And no one else has a T-14 hyperdrive, I promise you that.
We shall be robbed and crunched.
Not likely. We have nothing of value. That's our problem.
Well, it's too dangerous to call for help.
A ship without a power supply isn't going to get us anywhere. And there's something about this boy.
Has anybody ever seen a pod race? I'm the only human who can do it.
There is no other way. I may not like it, but he can help you. He was meant to help you.
A virgins, you say?
Located around a person?
A boy. The cells have the highest concentration of midichlorians I have seen in a life form. It is possible he was conceived by the midichlorians.
Now is not the time for this. The Senate is voting for a new Supreme Chancellor, and Queen Amidala is returning home, which will put pressure on the Federation and could widen the confrontation.
And draw out the Queen's attacker.
Go with the Queen to Naboo and discover the identity of this Dark Warrior. This is the clue we need to unravel the mystery of the Sith. I think it is time we inform the Senate that our ability to use the Force is diminished.
Only the Dark Lord of the Sith knows of our weakness. If informed the Senate is, multiply, our adversaries will.
Our friends from the Trade Federation have pledged their support. And when their battle droids are combined with yours, we shall have an army greater than any in the galaxy. The Jedi will be overwhelmed.
I have good news for you, my lord. War has begun.
Excellent. Everything is going as planned.
Yes, thanks to your 2 Jedi Knights. They killed Count Dooku. But General Grievous has escaped once again.
General Grievous will run and hide as he always does. He's a coward.
But with Count Dooku dead, he is the leader of the droid army. And I assure you, the Senate will vote to continue the war as long as Grievous is alive.
Anakin, our allegiance is to the Senate, not to its leader, who has managed to stay in office long after his term has expired.
The Senate demanded that he stay longer. Yes, but use your feelings, Anakin. Something is out of place. You're asking me to do something against the Jedi Code. Against the Republic. Against a mentor and a friend. That's what's out of place here. Why are you asking this of me? The Council is asking you.
After you have killed all the Jedi in the Temple, go to the Mustafar system. Wipe out Viceroy Gunray and the other separatist leaders.
Padme. Anakin has turned to the dark side.
This is not a problem in of itself, as we've discussed already vis-a-vis Lucas's intent towards a younger audience, but it is exacerbated by characters that are too often mouthpieces for the plot and themes, rather than being characters with relationships on their own merits. This inconsistency, particularly around Anakin and his motivations, that were too often at the mercy of the direction of the plot, thus robbing him of his agency, at odds with the consistency of relationships and character growth seen in the original trilogy. We can see that at work in the Phantom Menace, when the seeds of Anakin's downfall are planted. Introduced as a wide-eyed boy asking Padme, "Are you an angel?" Anakin is more of a symbol of innocence, rather than a character with genuine curiosity. A puppet for the theme of the story. Qui-Gon declares that Anakin is the chosen one, with a midi-chlorian count higher than Yoda's, rather than Lucas showing us his innate Force potential, a mouthpiece for world-building in place of character. In Attack of the Clones, Anakin is internally conflicted. I know this because he says so. Repeatedly.
It's worse. He's overly critical. He never listens. He doesn't understand. And now that I'm with you again, I'm in agony.
I'm sorry, I don't have a choice.
I'm a Jedi. I know I'm better than this.
His infamous confession to Padme, a line that should be a chilling precursor of his eventual fall, losing its impact because of Padme's response. Fighting the urge to write fan fiction, as so many of my contemporaries have, and many fans do to excuse George's poor execution, I really do feel like Anakin should have lied to Padme, whether directly or by omission, about what really happened on Tatooine. She then eventually puts the pieces together in Revenge of the Sith after the massacre at the temple, and then she chooses to run, because Anakin has grown possessive out of fear, and consumed by his new power, becoming a danger to her and her unborn children. Oh look! Now Leia's line in Return of the Jedi about remembering her mother still makes sense. And the love story is a tragedy of possession, as intended.
And of course that's the problem with Anakin ultimately is you're allowed to love people, but you're not allowed to possess them. And what he did is that he, fell in love and then married her and then became jealous. And then he saw in his visions that she was going to die. He couldn't stand losing her. So in order to not lose her, he made a pact with the devil to be able to become all-powerful. But of course when he did that, she didn't want to have anything to do with him anymore. So he lost her. Once you were powerful, being able to bring her back from the dead, well, if I can do that, then I can be Emperor of the Universe. I can get rid of the Emperor, I can do everything. I can make everything the way I want it.
Sorry, George, but I've realised in the end you really did Padme dirty. Perhaps unconsciously, but all the same. Likewise, the romance between Anakin and Padme, which is carried by lines like,
"The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe."
And,
If you follow your thoughts through to conclusion, it'll take us to a place we cannot go, regardless of the way we feel about each other.
Then you do feel something.
lacks the emotional depth to convince audiences of their bond, particularly when compared to Han and Leia's romantic exchanges. Growing up listening to this level of riz, it's a miracle that I managed to find someone to spend my life with.
I have made it with a woman. Inform the men.
Dialogue across the prequels is notoriously uneven. Lines like, "I don't like sand," or "communications disruption can only mean one thing," have become memes, that while for many have become a symbol of endearment for the prequels, are still markers of George's weaknesses for writing dialogue. Yet across the prequels, and in Revenge of the Sith particularly, there are some moments of genuine intrigue. Palpatine's "the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural," encapsulates the allure of forbidden knowledge. Obi-Wan's speeches on Mustafar and Padme's tragic "so this is how liberty dies" carry thematic weight even when surrounded by stilted exchanges. At its best, the dialogue reinforces the trilogy's themes of fear, temptation, ambition, and corruption. But at its worst, it alienates audiences with awkward phrasing and unnatural delivery. And the best comparison I can give to illustrate this argument when skewed positively is Ewan McGregor, whom, despite also being a victim of plot-driven action rather than internal character motivation, earned the respect of the audience regardless because his age and performance sold them on a young Alec Guinness Obi-Wan. Well, less the moment he, the level-headed Jedi, leapt headlong out the window of a skyscraper. To this day, I'm not sure why he did that instead of the impulsive Anakin, but anyway. But, all that said, this is the one time I will accept the George may have had too much control argument.
What?
When directing A New Hope, a young George Lucas, famously introverted and uncomfortable around his crew and actors, only ever had 2 lines of direction to give. That was great, and do it again but faster. Performance and character nuance were not George's strong suit, a fact that he has self-admitted, which is why he sought directors like Irvin Kershner and Richard Marquand for Empire and Jedi. It's also common knowledge that actors like Harrison Ford actively worked with the directors, including George, to find a more natural way of delivering some of the clunkier lines, the most famous example being, "I love you, I know." Easily argued by Ford on the original trilogy, as he was in the trenches with Lucas, who was not yet the Star Wars legend he would become in the wake of Return of the Jedi. During the original trilogy, all parties were working through the process together, figuring it out and making it work, with George happy to let his directors do their thing as long as they shot the scenes the way he wanted to give him freedom in the editing room and didn't blow out his budget. George had planned to do similar for the prequels, requesting directors like Steven Spielberg, Ron Howard, or Robert Zemeckis to sit in the chair for Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith while he worked the magic behind the scenes. But all potential directors echoed the same sentiment. It's an impossible act to follow, George. This is your baby. We think you should do it. But as you'll recall, Lucas the filmmaker is not, creatively speaking, the same man who set to work making The Phantom Menace as the naive young filmmaker who made Star Wars A New Hope. The young, timid and introverted director from 1977 was now a multi-millionaire father of 3 and the president of a large technical production studio, with 20 years' experience under his belt. Despite being out of practice as a director, Lucas had always had a talent for filmmaking, and his vision for the prequels was clear, even if his weaknesses for writing dialogue and coaching actors was still present. So when he gave direction on the set, everybody, from child actor to classically trained British stage veterans, followed his lead. Who was going to tell George Lucas, the creator of the most successful trilogy in cinema history at that point in time, that he was getting it wrong? No one, because in their eyes, he probably wasn't. George had earned their trust, Star Wars was his baby, and the best directors in the world had said no. So now the only thing left to do was to trust what George was describing, hit their marks, and deliver their dialogue as instructed. The final result is a clinical and declarative stanza of exposition from the script made manifest, and a world left to wonder how things might have looked if Spielberg had had the guts to step up to the plate. The direction and dialogue is the result of an out-of-practice Lucas who never had much natural director-actor flair, being forced to take the reins due to the fear of the best directors in Hollywood not wanting to be the ones known as the guy who botched the next Star Wars movie.
I can feel your anger.
The original trilogy works because it marries timeless myth with clear character arcs, consistent pacing, universal themes, natural performances, and technical innovation that served story. The prequels, though ambitious in terms of world building and thematic nuance, suffer from muddled arcs, uneven tones, stilted performances, and great expectation. It is a victim of its era, judged under the microscope of expectation and nostalgia. By the late 1990s, Star Wars was not just a beloved film series, it was a cultural religion. Fans wanted the impossible, a story that would both recreate the wonder of their childhood and also expand on the mythology in a way that matched decades of personal speculation. No trilogy could have satisfied such expectation. The prequels were not judged on their own merits, but against an idealised memory and a fandom's hopes for more. The flaws magnified by the crushing weight of those same hopes. It's the reason children had no issue when compared to adults, because they had yet to form their own preconceptions, biasing their potential enjoyment. As I said, the topic of prequel dislike is complicated, but hopefully you can see, by pulling on even a single thread, how all these pieces fit together.
Pull the thread.
Get this trash out of here!
And how it's not a simple task to dissect the how and why of this question. But the thing about fandom appreciation is that it can evolve over time. The original trilogy still stands as a timeless fairy tale, one that has become cinematic legend. And while the prequels remain a flawed but fascinating experiment that failed to have the same cultural impact as its predecessor, it has only grown in popularity as the target audience grows older and begins to share their love for it with the world. Both together, however, form the saga of Star Wars, a modern epic whose cultural gravity continues to shape our imaginations, unlike the creatively bankrupt leeching that followed. Comparing Disney to Lucas deserves its own video, but in short, there were two paths taken. Disney's was to give fans what they thought they wanted, producing a lab-grown blockbuster that stoked nostalgic coals, hoping they'd burst with new life, eventually running out due to a lack of substance and leaving a hollow husk behind. George gave them what he thought they needed, risking the burn by adding something new and doing something different, but ensuring that once those flames took hold, they would be satiated by a renewed source. Either way, the heat was on, and while George may have burned some of his initial audience in 1999, I know which films I can happily re-watch and appreciate for their intent despite their implementation, and which ones feel like a soullessly inconsistent cash grab.
This isn't how it's supposed to be. Jungle, finish her off.
So, that should give you some idea as to why some folks still don't like the prequels. Whether or not you agree with the sentiment is ultimately your business. All I ask is that you keep the gloves up with your chosen sparring partner should you choose to punch on in the comments. And as always, please be respectful of each other when you do so. As for me, as stated at the beginning of all this, I bloody love the prequels, including Jar Jar, believing them to be in a totally different class to Disney Star Wars, so please limit the fracture side moving forward. I do encourage Discord, however, and love talking about Lucas Star Wars, so my comment section will remain open. Just do your best not to be a deckhead. The prequels are, and always will be, more than the sum of their parts, especially in terms of the technological innovations they wrought. And while they are by no means perfect in their storytelling execution, I would encourage everyone to take a larger view of their influence and legacy, and maybe take a moment to appreciate the intent of Hollywood's best independent filmmaker. A man who fought the system at every turn to tell his story the way he wanted. Not for the money, but for the love of his craft. Whom's tombstone will read, hopefully not anytime soon, and regardless of Disney's continued failings, George Lucas, creator of Star Wars. Hooroo, Skipper.